Lewis Hamilton is genuinely having the worst start to an F1 season he's ever had. Why didn't he just give up and quit? This is me talking here. I found an op-ed about this topic and I would like to, share my feelings on it. Jonathan McAvoy from the Mail Online wrote an article about Lewis Hamilton and how, in his own opinion, Lewis would be better suited in giving up on 2024 altogether, instead of just carrying on with the season in a car which is, quite ambiguous right now. I have opinions on that. Hold your horses here. This isn't just some guy writing an article just for the sake of it with nothing to back it up. There is some historical context going on in this article, and it's coming from somebody who worked very closely in getting Lewis Hamilton to Mercedes. You remember that Nikki Lauda had a couple of years when he wasn't in Formula 1, that he had raced for Brabham, then he stopped for a bit, and then he went back to McLaren again, where he got the 1984 title by half a point from Alain Prost? Well, there was a reason why he wasn't in Formula 1 between 1980 and 1982, and that was down to the fact that he basically just walked out of his contract with Brabham, and that was mainly down to the car being, as he would so often and infamously put it, a bit of a ship box. Do I really need to explain to you why I can't say the proper pronunciation? Lauda's love for the sport completely broke down at Brabham. He was just driving around in circles in a Brabham BT48, which was seen as incredibly unreliable and lacked performance in the midst of the 1970s ground effect era, most notably because the engine was completely unsuited for those conditions. And as we all know from the movie Rush and many other soundbites that we've heard about Nikki Lauda, he does not mince his words. If he does not like something, and if he realizes that there's no point going racing and that it would be not worth his time, he's just gonna go ahead and do it. And Bernie Ecclestone was just like, okay, well, give us your overalls then, because we're gonna need them. He just walked out, went back to Austria, focused on his airline, and that was that for a couple of years. This isn't a case of Lauda just throwing his toys out of the pram. They brought an entirely brand new car, the BT49, with a completely brand new engine, and guess what? It was just as bad. Well, Mr. McAvoy, I see your Nikki Lauda story, and I raise you a Juan Pablo Montoya story. Probably one of the more recent cases of jaded F1 drivers seeking pastures new. Juan Pablo had grown weary of the world of F1 politics, as well as the culture of McLaren in the 2000s, as well as the attitude of Ron Dennis. I honestly wouldn't blame him. Around the time of the mid-2000s of McLaren, it looked incredibly clinical, boring, grey, and just, it looked awful instead of the passionate red of Ferrari. And then I wouldn't blame him also for getting ants in his pants about the fact that Fernando Alonso was going to be joining the team to replace Kimi Raikkonen in 2007, because at that time no one was quite sure where Kimi was going. This was before Michael announced his retirement. Everyone was thinking maybe he might have gone to Ferrari to partner Schumacher, maybe? Wow, Schumacher-Raikkonen partnership, that would have been really cool. But either way, there was a lot of discontent at McLaren, and that was on top of all of the internal conflict that Juan Pablo had at Williams, which led to him going to McLaren for 2005, so at Woking he was just getting more of the same. So then he decided to go back to America, go back to Chip Ganassi in NASCAR. When he announced it and Ron Dennis got wind of it, Ron just went like, okay, Juan, go away, you betrayed us, go! Okay, maybe not quite as dramatically as that, illustrative purposes. Granted, that incident was a little bit more passionate than with Lauda, who was more logical and analytical because the car wasn't getting him results, so what was the point? But it was still an abrupt end to a career which was still in its prime. Because you may not think it, but at the time when he quit F1, Lauda was only 30 years old. He had still plenty of gas in the tank. If Juan Pablo Montoya had a good car throughout his career, he could have picked up where Mika Hakkinen left off. He was one of the few drivers that really could give Michael Schumacher a run for his money, and especially before the likes of Fernando Alonso came online fully at Renault, and we could have a really fun time of Montoya and Schumacher, their temperaments completely different, and of course 2004 Imola, just Juan Pablo raging against the system all the time. He was a rebel! It's just a shame that Williams completely fell off after 2004 in their walrus car. And then McLaren in 2005 had problems of their own, and then 2006 wasn't much better since he and Kimi basically just wrote off that car as a complete non-hoper for a title contention. But let's bring things back to Lewis Hamilton and his current lot of life in Formula 1. Should he really give up on F1 in 2024 and instead just focus on 2025, away from the limelight, and just try and get his mindset back in place after a couple of years of being in the wilderness and sort of having to deal with the likes of George Russell stepping on his toes? It's far too early to suggest that because we're only 3 races in the case of this, and when you look back at Lauda and Montoya and their weariness with Formula 1, these 2 incidents happened started well into the season. In the case of Lauda, it was practically right at the end of the 1979 campaign. There were only 2 races left. So as far as he was concerned, that season was pretty much done. And with Montoya, I think he was planning to see the season out, but then it completely broke down within the space of a week, and then before we knew it, Juan Pablo was out on his hook. It could have happened a bit later, but then it might not have, because Ron Dennis decided to blink first. But in this current iteration of Formula 1, not being in the sport is almost worse than being in the sport, but right at the back, or not performing nearly as well as you would ideally like to. And of course, Lewis Hamilton is not wrong by saying that the start to 2024 has been the worst in his entire career. As I mentioned in my video earlier in the week, when you look back through his stats, he is not wrong. He is not waxing lyrical or saying it for effect. So if McAvoy really wanted to use the Lauda argument at its fullest, then really this should have been happening about halfway through the season, because you can't compare those two, because Lauda was right at the end of the season and probably at the end of his tether, whereas Lewis Hamilton is right at the beginning of the season, and he can bring the car home. It can still score points. It's not as many points as he would have liked. And then, of course, there was some problems with setup and Mercedes trying to find its feet. But you got to remember here, Mercedes isn't just sitting around idly just going, well, we have a bad car, okay, may as well get out the deck chairs. No, Mercedes is working tooth and nail to try and find out what the problem is. They are spending every single waking moment in every single practice session trying to get on top of what the problem is. And as I will talk about a bit more later, they are starting to find a pattern which might be able to solve the problem a little bit quicker than they might have hoped. I know that engine failures with Mercedes are as rare as hen's teeth, but still, you can't just condemn Mercedes after one power unit failure, because all the other situations he has scored. When you look at Lauda's career in 1979, that was awful. He was only in the points twice. And okay, he scored in both of those instances, which showed that he did have the pace when the car decided to play ball. When you look at Montoya's 2006 season, that was mainly down to the team dynamics, but with his reliability, it was relatively okay. Look at 2001, his first season with Williams in an F1. That was terrible. He barely finished. And when he did finish, I think realistically, he could have been in contention for maybe taking out David Coulthard from second place in the championship. He certainly had way more poles than Ralf Schumacher. But it makes me wonder though, had Juan Pablo just stuck it out for 2007, then maybe we might have seen Fernando and he going for the title, and maybe he might have clinched it. Lewis has only been 3 races of 2024 with a brand new car concept, the third in as many years, especially since it's meant to be a car that was tailored to be more geared towards his own style of driving. And yes, of course, before you type it down in the comments, I am well aware that Mercedes should really have gotten their act together and listened to Lewis Hamilton's feedback a little bit earlier in the entire ground effect era, maybe in 2022. Instead of just laying in wait, just clinging onto the hope of George Russell's consistency in the first half of 2022 when he was in the top 5 until Silverstone, and that Zhou crash. Maybe they should have focused more on the car instead of coming up with a document to try and change the rules to their advantage, which turned out not to be at their advantage. In fact, it turned out to be at their detriment. But let me give you a hypothetical here. If Lewis Hamilton were to attend Suzuka, have yet another mediocre or calamitous race where he either barely scores any points or he has another DNF, he calls a press conference, no one's quite sure what it is, and he decides to announce that he is no longer going to be taking part in 2024, it would cause a huge and major uproar amongst Formula One. The fallout from this would be even greater than what Sebastian Vettel caused in 2022. And that was because we still had a farewell tour to go through, but if Lewis Hamilton just decided to up sticks and leave immediately without any sign of continuing in the season, then that pretty much would be writing off 2024 altogether. The fans would probably just leave the sport in droves until he would come back with Ferrari. It would be absolute bedlam. It would completely condemn Mercedes in the eyes of the sporting world, and it probably would do some damage to Lewis Hamilton's credibility as well. So I really don't see this happening. Quite frankly, I think that in this situation, if Lewis Hamilton were to do it, then nobody wins. Well, except their reserve driver, Mick Schumacher, who would be immediately called up and then given the rest of the season to try and see what he can do before they can find a full-time replacement. I am a Mick Schumacher fan, but I really wouldn't want him to have gotten this plum in those circumstances. Many people thinking that, oh, he's just there as the temp. I'm just stating who's listed as Mercedes reserve driver. I'm being objective here this time. Throughout his whole career, Lewis Hamilton has been seen to be a driver who never gives up, triumphs over adversities, and throughout all of his time, he still rises. And if he were to stop in 2024, yes, some people would applaud him for being honest with his emotions and feelings, and that he wouldn't want to just continue to beat his head around with a hammer and just keep on going just for the sake of it. I get that. But in the world of Formula One, you really need to be fit all the time. even if you're just at the back or not doing as great as you could in a Formula One car, it's still a Formula One car, and it's still great for your fitness. You're still in the mindset of the sport. And if you're going to Ferrari and you're replacing the likes of Carlos Sainz, who so far is doing a blinder of a job and causing so many feel-good stories to be sprouted amongst many other different journalistic sources, then you've really got to bring your A game. And if you're sitting out the sport for a good several months before you can then start working with Ferrari, you might take a couple of races to get yourself adjusted. And if you're Lewis Hamilton, no one's really going to have that much patience with you. They're expecting you to be really good from day one, from free practice one. Like Sebastian was in 2015, the second race of his Ferrari tenure, he goes and wins the Malaysian Grand Prix. But at the same time, I understand that if he were to leave Mercedes, then that would draw a line on all of his struggles, and it may potentially save him from further drubbings, perhaps from George Russell, or other reliability issues. The W15, it's still a bit of a cryptic car, but it's a car that does have moments of potential, as Lewis has said. What if that potential is bottled, and then they can fully embrace it, and then the car turns out to be pretty good? What if the car eventually gets over its teething troubles and turns out to be pretty decent, that can compete for podiums again? It may seem impossible right now, but we've got to look at the other wonderful story that we saw in 2023. McLaren had to change their concept entirely throughout the winter to get what we get with the MCL60, and then look what happened by the time we got to Silverstone once they found their feet with the upgrades. It turned out to be the second fastest car throughout the remainder of the season. It and Red Bull were right up there, and in Brazil, in terms of cars, not cars and drivers, McLaren were the fastest. And that's McLaren with their Woking facilities, which are only just being ramped up. Brackley, Mercedes, their facilities are first rate, and they don't view that as part of the problem. In fact, the Brackley facilities, the Mercedes factory, is going through an expansion. They're improving their facilities. They are constantly upgrading because they have the capital, they have the resources. It's just, according to Toto, the problem that they have is it's a physics issue, and it's to do with the car. Once they solve that problem, everything will be potentially back in harmony again. It's just a question of patience. And if you've run out of patience, then do hear me out here, because James Allison, the guy who is responsible for the W15, has said that he's starting to see some patterns that might give them a clue as to what to do with the W15 to give it a little bit more oomph, or at least a little bit more, consistency. And it's got something to do with temperature changes throughout the different sessions. There have been no setup changes between FP3, where the cars were pretty good and it was quite cool, and qualifying, where the temperatures were higher and Lewis crashed out of Q2. Allison goes on to saying that they have found the quirk with this performance, and if they can bottle it and figure out what they need to do, then this could yield some better results and a little bit more consistency and correlation with the wind tunnel. Then he does go on to say that it could go one of two ways, that it could be a quick and dirty problem that they can solve with maybe doing a bodge job on some bodywork, or with a quick tweak or quick upgrade, or it could be something majorly fundamental down in the bowels of the car, which requires almost a practical B-spec car, which we probably might not see until the likes of, I don't know, Canada, where Lewis Hamilton is pretty much at his strongest. It's one of his best circuits. And I kept telling you that just wait. The W15, I don't think it will be at its competitive best until we get to maybe Canada or Hungary halfway through the season. And yes, that's a very long time. But that is the rod that Mercedes chose for their own back. That they have changed the concept again, and concepts take time to fully realize their full potential. But in the immediate future, if you're wondering about what might happen at the Japanese Grand Prix, well, according to the forecast right now, the temperatures are looking relatively cool, maybe around about like 16 degrees air temperature. This might prove to be quite good for Mercedes. They might be relatively competitive, or at least a little bit more consistent, because they're not great with the high-speed corners. At least this might mean that we see both Mercedes in Q3. So if Lewis were to quit right now, and the W15 goes on to being quite competitive, and going back to being the third or maybe second fastest car, right up there with Ferrari and McLaren, then Lewis Hamilton might end up with egg on his face. Not to mention with a very hefty bill, perhaps, about a buyout clause, and having to step out of his contract, being in breach of it. But don't worry, I'm pretty sure that his best friend John Elkann, the chairman of Ferrari, would be more than happy to help stump up the bill, just for the sake of getting Lewis Hamilton as a Ferrari ambassador that little bit earlier, and then making the air at Ferrari with Carlos and Charles a little bit more awkward at the same time. But who cares? Lewis Hamilton's in the Ferrari fold a little earlier than expected. And another thing that makes me doubt that Lewis Hamilton would actually walk away from Mercedes before the season's over is Fernando Alonso, one of his arch nemesis. Because those 4 years at McLaren, Fernando, He didn't walk away. And yes, I know that you're going to say that between 2015 and 2017, his contract had no opt-out clauses, so he couldn't have left even if he wanted to. But listen, this is Fernando Alonso. He is outspoken. And if he really had had enough, he probably would have paid to break the contract, because contracts can be broken. And with the right person and the right backer, I think there could have been some sort of situation. And even in 2018, when he was no longer tied to McLaren, he could have left, and he did leave. He didn't leave McLaren because he had had enough of Formula One and he wanted to retire. No, he said that he had no regrets about going to McLaren. He had belief for the longest time that they would eventually solve their problems, and they did go on to solve those problems, just not with Fernando at the helm. And as we saw, Fernando just didn't wander off into the distance, into the sunset, go off into retirement. He said that he had bigger challenges. What does he go off and do? He goes off and does endurance racing and turns out to be amazing with Toyota. He goes off and does the Indy 500. He's okay, but at least he gave it a go. He goes off and does a little bit of rallying. He turns out to be not too shabby. Whatever Fernando Alonso puts his mind at, he is a really good driver. And in terms of his future in Formula One, it's a case of mind over matter. So long as he wants to be in Formula One, he's going to stay in it. Even if he's no longer the best, he's still more than good enough compared to many other drivers up and down the grid. Fernando kept himself busy. He was doing stuff all the time. He was involved in very major motorsport. He was training immensely hard. He was not slowing down. And he therefore got the results. He was winning things left, right, and center. He was just proving to us all that Fernando Alonso is probably one of the most complete drivers on the planet right now, which meant that when he came back to Formula One with Alpine, he was pretty good still. He got a podium. And then, as we saw in 2023, he had one of his best seasons ever. So therefore, Fernando, in his 40s, still had the magic because he did not stop. And his tenure with McLaren, it was terrible. He could barely get it across the line. He had all of those meltdowns over the radio, but he still stuck at it. He did not break the contract, and that means I reckon that Lewis Hamilton would not give up on Mercedes, despite this probably ending up being one of his worst seasons ever if this trend continues. And yes, I understand that the gap that Fernando had between Formula One stints was a couple of years. Instead, for Lewis, it would just be at most maybe 9 or so months, but that kind of makes it all the more puzzling. What would Lewis Hamilton do in that time? Train some more? Take some more pictures with his dogs? Go and maybe do a little bit of music? Maybe do some philanthropy or do some other things? Because Lewis Hamilton, he does keep himself busy. He is pretty talented when it comes to all of his extracurricular activities outside of Formula One. But the question is though, all this stuff is not motorsport. I don't really see him doing any other sort of motorsport. There wouldn't be enough time for him to get to grips with it. So no, Lewis leaving Mercedes early would be a terrible idea for all concerned. It would leave Lewis at a disadvantage for his new life in red. Again, driving a slower than ideal Formula One car is better than not driving a Formula One car at all. Sure, it might not be the best way for him to end his tenure with Mercedes, but he's still got his hand in the game. He's still involved. And if he were to take himself out of the sport for several months and clear his head, sure, he might be refreshed like Daniel Ricciardo was when he stepped back in again. He turned out that he really needed it after his McLaren spate. But as we've seen with Daniel Ricciardo, it's not guaranteed that he was immediately on it right when he came back into the game. So with Lewis Hamilton, it's probably better for him to remain in the sport as it develops and just be part of it. Even though he might be potentially iced out of many things at Mercedes, it might be immensely awkward right now, he's still in the sport. Not only that, but he's also got a huge responsibility. His social media clout is massive, the biggest in the sport. If he were to call a press conference and say, I'm tired of Mercedes, I quit, and then the firestorm afterward, it would be immense. People working for Mercedes would be sent countless amounts of abuse. Absolutely. Lewis needs to be careful. If Lewis were to leave and walk away, he wouldn't care what would happen at Mercedes. He would be on to his next era of his Formula One career. The twilight years, in red, at Maranello in Italy. The Tifosi would absolutely love him going over there. But the fallout he would leave behind in Brackley, and anyone who's a fan of the Silver Arrows, it would be horrifically terrible for anyone working there. They're not trying to sabotage his career. They are trying their best to fix the problem and give Lewis a better car. If Lewis were to completely disregard that and only think about himself in this situation, not only would he have not really that much to do in relevance to motorsport, but it would probably be the biggest insult he could possibly give the team that had given him so much, and they've had so much good times together. So yeah, I don't see him sitting out the next 9 months. I don't see this as a situation as bad as the BT48 of Brabham, or the situation at McLaren with Montoya. It could get worse perhaps, yeah, but right now, it's far too soon to call time on Lewis's career in 2024, just for the sake of maybe avoiding some embarrassment. Just be patient. Lewis might turn out to have a better season after all. And again, it's better to keep yourself involved in the sport than not. So I mentioned that Mick could be parachuted in if Lewis did decide to skip town, but would he be the ideal pick for a longer stint? Well, I made this video right when Lewis made his announcement about going to Ferrari, and I still stand by this, so if you want to go and watch this video, go right ahead. I quite like it.